Okay, we're back with part 3 of this little mini series on Vue 3 function refs. In the first part, we looked at what function refs are and why they're useful, kind of some basic use cases for them to get access to DOM elements from inside of composition functions. Then in part 2, we looked at V4 and how you can use function refs to get access to lists of DOM elements that can be rendered, sort of arbitrary numbers of them, how to store them properly and access them. And then in this video, I want to look at some tools that I've written, some stuff that I've published on NPM that makes it a little bit easier to do things like bind values to attributes on elements or set up event listeners from within composition functions. So to support us in that, I have started with a little paired input, checkbox input, and a label here. Right now, they're not set up properly so that you can click the label to toggle the checkbox. Right now, you can only click the checkbox. Ideally, you'd be able to click the label as well, and it would toggle the checkbox. And the normal way to do that is to set an ID on the checkbox input or whatever input you're working with, and then set that same ID to the for attribute of the label. And now, when I click this label, I can toggle the checkbox on and off. So this is fine, this works, but it's annoying if I'm trying to build a custom checkbox component that other developers can use. I could accept a prop for the ID and they could pass in a unique ID. But that's, this is the exact kind of thing that is nice to do from within a composition function. Just get rid of that functionality and get rid of that mess so that we stick to this plain API where people are pretty much just setting up their input with the necessary attributes and whatever CSS or whatever they want to add, and then they just bind function refs and they get access to all the functionality that they might expect from this kind of a component. So we're going to flip over to the use checkbox composition function that I set up. It's a basic one here. We just have, the use checkbox function. It creates a function ref for the checkbox and a function ref for the label, and then it returns those. And then flipping back to our template, we bind those to the label and the checkbox in our DOM. And the idea is that we, as the developer using this composition function, would trust that all kinds of interesting features are being taken care of for us. So if we want to just sort of manually do this bind feature, we could import onMounted from Vue, and we can say onMounted, and then we'll say checkbox value.id equals, and then probably best if we set up an ID here outside of onMounted. You can imagine that this ID would be programmatically generated. Maybe you'd get a UUID, or you'd just do like an auto-incrementing counter or something. Some sort of method to guarantee that this ID is going to be unique for every checkbox on the page and for any page. Lots of different ways to solve that problem, but for now we're just going to stick with this plain ID string to keep it simple. But we would do checkbox.value.id equals ID, and then we would do label.value.html4 equals ID. And with that done, we've done that, we've taken care of that functionality inside of our composition function, and now anybody who uses our function will get a label and a checkbox that are properly connected, so you can toggle the checkbox properly. So this is kind of like the simplest case, right, of binding a value to an attribute. It's a static value. It's not going to change. You just have to put it in two places. There's lots of varying degrees, though, of complexity. Sometimes you want to bind reactive data to an attribute, or you want to bind the same piece of data to a bunch of elements in an array. For all those kinds of use cases, I wrote this function that we're importing up here called bind. And this is coming from the Baleada Vue Features package. So Baleada is just a big toolkit of different stuff that I write for Vue and web apps and configuration tools and stuff like that. Vue Features has tons of different exports, but one of them is this bind function. This is designed to be like vbind, but for use within composition functions. So here's an example of how we would do this. We would call bind, and then the first argument here, the first and only argument, is this sort of configuration option. You can think of it like that, a configuration object. It's going to have an element property, and we're going to pass a reactive reference to an element that we want to bind something to. And so in this case, we're doing checkbox, and then we have to set up the values and attributes that we want to bind to. we do a values object. Inside of this values object, we can just list key value pairs. The key is a DOM attribute, an element attribute, and then the value can be a bunch of different stuff. It can be reactive references. There's a kind of like a callback function syntax for some advanced use cases. But for this one, we just have the plain string, and it actually matches the attribute exactly, so we can just sort of spread it in that way. So we are binding the ID that way, and then we also want to bind to the label element. We want to set up another values object here, and then for this one, the for attribute should be ID. And notice, notice two things. First of all, we don't have to call bind inside of onMounted, so we can get rid of that import. Bind kind of collects information from your configuration object here, and it calls onMounted internally. So you don't have to worry about any of that effect timing. That stuff is all taken care of for you. And then also note that there are some attributes like HTML4 where we can just pass for instead, and bind will know what to do with that. You can also do things like camel cased area. You can do like area selected, and bind would know that the attribute it's supposed to bind to is actually area dash selected. So lots of nice little ergonomic features like that. But let's just prove that it works. First things first. So here we have, yes, our label is properly connected. Those attributes are bound. And actually, let's open this up in a new tab so we can inspect it and just prove that. We're going to look in here and down in here. Actually, just do it this way. Okay, so yes, we have the ID is set to ID, and HTML4 is set to ID as well. So now let's look at something a little bit different. Let's flip back to our useDimension composition function that we were working with before, the one that sets up this array of elements to track their dimensions individually. And we're going to replace all of this observer management code and the onMounted call and onBeforeOnMount. All this stuff we can replace with the von that I wrote for composition functions. So for this one, we do import on from at Baleada Vue Features, and we can actually just copy this right here. And we can do, well, actually, let's just do that one. And we can get rid of all this. We can call on. On, just like bind, accepts this configuration object thing as its only parameter, and it has also the element property. Bind and on can both accept either a single element here or a reactive reference to multiple elements. So we'll pass the array in here. And then on, instead of values like bind, it has this key called effects. And this is where we set up side effects that we want to perform when certain events happen. And there's lots of flexibility here. You can do like, basic stuff like click or key down. You can also do stuff like keystrokes and things like that. In this case, though, we're going to do resize. That's the keyword that we use to set up the resize observer internally. And then we're going to pass the callback that we want to run. And we want to grab, let's see, I think we want to grab the target from here, equals entries dot target. And then we'll so target dot text content equals that. I think this should all be good now. If we reload here, yep, these are all now working. So yeah, what on is doing here, this little von equivalent for composition functions, it's iterating through the entire, when the component is mounted, it's iterating through the list of elements that we've captured with our function ref, and it's setting up a resize observer for each one with this callback. Again, there's more advanced syntaxes that you can use for different kind of edge cases with dealing with event listeners. For this one, we're just passing the event callback directly to the resize key. And then, so yeah, that's getting added. The resize observer is getting set up. And also, what's really great is that the resize observer will be automatically disconnected and garbage collected at the end. On takes care of all of that stuff internally. So we can get rid of a bunch of stuff here. We can get rid of shallow ref, onMounted, onBeforeOnMount. and we can just have a much simpler composition function and trust that this is going to do all of our work for us. So yeah, like I said, there's lots of different use cases for bind and on. I've got full documentation on baleada.dev. If you scroll down in the sidebar here, it's in the features section, and the subsection is affordances. That's what I call these functions. These are like affordances, things that the template affords you that you don't generally get in composition functions, and this is kind of my solution to how to get access to those. So we've got vbind, a vmodel equivalent, von that we just looked at, and we also have vshow. This one's really cool too because it also allows you to pass a transition configuration so that you can do enter, appear, and leave transitions, just like vshow would let you do with the transition component. So really fun stuff. Looking forward to see if anybody starts using this approach in their composition functions, because there's really a ton that you can do here when you're building accessible user interfaces and setting up keyboard navigation and all kinds of things that can be abstracted. Again, with the end goal of leaving our templates super clean, where we basically just bind function refs where they need to go, and then we're pretty much free to set any classes or do any styling or add any additional attributes or anything like that. And we can trust that all the advanced functionality will be taken care of for us by composition functions. So let me know if you have any questions on Baleada Vue features. I'm still pre 1.0, so lots of work to do on that stuff. But yeah, hope to see if anybody uses it, and I will see you in the next video.